Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. And like I mentioned last Monday, I'm sticking with the poetry and songs from The Lord of the Rings for Series 8's readings on Third Age Thursday. The feedback from all of you on this was really encouraging. Today we're going to be looking at the Song of Eärendil, also known as the Eärendilynwe, or Short Lay of Eärendil, though we'll probably only be looking at it in part because it really is a long one. Now, I've just mentioned a name of this poem that some of you, maybe even most of you, have not heard, the Eärendilynwe, and that's found in the Treason of Isengard, which is the 7th volume of History of Middle-earth, where Christopher Tolkien goes into great detail about this song. As you probably know, Tolkien wrote several poems about Eärendil. I'm going to tell you a bit more about two of those poems today. The first one that Tolkien ever wrote about Eärendil was written in September of 1914. It was originally titled The Voyage of Eärendil the Evening Star. It's published in the Book of Lost Tales, Volume 2, in the chapter called The Tale of Eärendil. Now, there's also a very short fragment, less than 40 lines, of an alliterative lay of Eärendil, started around the mid-20s, that was abandoned and never picked up again. And you can find that in the Lays of Beleriand, Poems Early Abandoned. But the poem that we're going to be looking at today and next week isn't based on either of those. The poem presented in The Lord of the Rings as being the work of Bilbo is actually based on yet another poem that originally was not about Eärendil. It's called Errantry, and you might know it from the adventures of Tom Bombadil. Now, going back to the Treason of Isengard, Christopher Tolkien writes, "No poem of my father's had so long and complex a history as that which he named Errantry. It issued ultimately in two entirely distinct poems, one of which was the song that Bilbo chanted at Rivendell." Christopher then goes through the history of the poem and how both of the distinct versions arose for the next 20 pages or so. It was most likely first written around the early 1930s. It's hard to say for sure, though, because Christopher says that even the earliest existing manuscript of the poem doesn't show the usual signs of being a first draft. He writes, "The earliest version that my father retained is a rough penciled manuscript without title. There were certainly preliminary workings behind it, now lost, since this text was set down without hesitations or corrections. But it seems very probable that it was, in fact, the first complete text of the poem, possibly that from which he read it to the original Inklings in the early 1930s. Now, that poem, in case you haven't read it, is a delightful little poem about a merry passenger, a messenger, a mariner, who goes on a series of bizarre adventures. It's Eärendil-like, but it isn't explicitly said to be Eärendil. It's also really hard to read out loud. Tolkien knew that, writing in letter 133 to Rainer Unwin, that the poem was written in a meter I invented, depending on trisyllabic assonances or near assonances, which is so difficult that except in this one example, I have never been able to use it again. It just blew out in a single impulse." And then in a 1966 letter to Donald Swann, the composer who was working with Tolkien on The Road Goes Ever On, Tolkien described the poem as a piece of verbal acrobatics and metrical hijinks, and was intended for recitation with great variations of speed. It needs a reciter or chanter capable of producing the words with great clarity, but in places with great rapidity. I see my challenge is going to be big. Tolkien then went through no less than 15 more iterations of the poem in what Christopher Tolkien calls the Rivendell version. Now, you can read many of these versions in their entirety in the Treason of Isengard, and you can see a gradual evolution of the poem from the Errantry version to the Song of Eärendil version. Each subsequent manuscript brought it closer to the form we have here, and which I should get to today. Now, if you've read both poems, you know that the Song of Eärendil version still sounds a lot like the Errantry version. It's got the same meter, the same use of internal rhyme and assonance, the same verbal acrobatics and metrical hijinks, to use Tolkien's phrases. However, the two poems only have one entire line in common, his scabbard of chalcedony, and that's it. Now, much later, as Tolkien was getting the adventures of Tom Bombadil ready for publication in 1962, he went back to the pre-Eärendil version. Not quite all the way back to the 1933 version, though, and that's what appears in the adventures of Tom Bombadil. Essentially, Tolkien created two different versions of what used to be the same poem, with both of them existing in the Legendarium. Because, in the preface to The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, Errantry is introduced as evidently made by Bilbo. This is indicated by its obvious relationship to the long poem recited by Bilbo as his own composition in the House of Elrond. In origin, a nonsense rhyme, it is, in the Rivendell version, found transformed and applied, somewhat incongruously, to the High Elvish and Númenórean legends of Eärendil, probably because Bilbo invented its metrical devices and was proud of them, thus giving a little nod to the common lineage of both poems, and maybe revealing a little of Tolkien's own well-earned pride at the metrical devices that he invented. Now, there's more on the fact that even this version wasn't Tolkien's final version, but that goes pretty far afield. For that, or for more on this poem in general, check out episode 141 of the Prancing Pony podcast. And if you want to hear Sean read those older versions, check out first season episodes 35, that's Tolkien Reading Day 2017, and 43 on Eärendil. But now, with all that as preliminary, let's read some of the actual song. Eärendil was a mariner that tarried in Arvernian. He built a boat of timber, fell to Nimbrethel to journey in. Her sails he wove of silver, fair of silver were her lanterns made. Her prow was fashioned like a swan, and light upon her banners laid. In panoply of ancient kings, in chained rings he armored him. His shining shield was scored with runes to ward all wounds and harm from him. His bow was made of dragon horn, his arrows shorn of ebony. Of silver was his habergeon, his scabbard of chalcedony. His sword of steel was valiant, of adamant his helmet tall, an eagle plume upon his crest, upon his breast an emerald. Beneath the moon and under star he wandered far from northern strands, bewildered on enchanted ways, beyond the days of mortal lands. From gnashing of the narrow ice, where shadow lies on frozen hills, from nether heats and burning waste, he turned in haste, and roving still on starless waters far astray, at last he came to night of naught, and passed, and never sight he saw of shining shore, nor light he sought. The winds of wrath came driving him, and blindly in the foam he fled. From west to east and errandless, unheralded he homeward sped. Now, we've only gotten through the first three stanzas, and I will say in one take, surprisingly, but we had a lot of preliminary stuff to cover. I think we'll manage to finish the rest of the stanzas next time. For now, let's look at these together. The first stanza is about the ship itself, and before we get to the sort of symbolism or the elements, I want to point out the really complex rhyme scheme. A, B, C, B. So the end of the first line of each couplet has assonance, or in some cases exact rhyme, with the middle of the second line of the couplet. Mariner tarried in, Timberfeld Nimbrethel. Then the end of each couplet rhymes with the end of the next couplet 2 lines later. Arvernian, journeyin. It's really complicated, and it does make it really hard to read. Now, as for the content of this stanza, it is full of references to the beauty and brightness of the ship Vingalot, starting with the wood from Nimbrethil, the white silver birch. That's what Nimbrethil means. It's white birch wood, the silver sails, you've got the silver lanterns, a prow in the shape of a swan. That last part especially sort of recalls the white ships of the Teleri and Aquilonde. Now, the second stanza is full of references to the beauty and majesty of Eärendil's gear. And we'll see throughout that the 9 stanzas are grouped in these thematic pairs that contrast with one another, and this is the first one. You have a stanza about the beauty of the ship, followed by a stanza about the beauty of his armor and weapons. Now, a few words to be aware of here. Panoply, that just means a full suit of armor. The OED says it connotes brightness and splendor. Ebony, that's a wood. It's native to India and Sri Lanka. And the Judds in Flora of Middle-earth point out it would not have been common in the Third Age of Middle-earth, which likely is precisely why this word was chosen by Bilbo as he composed the poem. After all, it's exotic. Now, a habergeon is a sleeveless coat or jacket of mail or scale armor. Chalcedony is a precious or semi-precious stone like onyx or agate. And Hammond and Skull, talking about adamant, point out that it is a rock or mineral of legend or folklore. The OED adds that now it's used poetically or rhetorically for the embodiment of surpassing hardness, that which is impregnable to any application of force. Then we get the line inspired by Aragorn, upon his breast an emerald. That's the green stone, presumably the Elessar. Finally, the third stanza shows our hero bewildered, lost and wandering in the dark, literally and figuratively. Bewildered on enchanted ways certainly refers to the Enchanted Isles, then protecting Valinor. So it's going to be interesting to see the next one because it will contrast with that, and we'll definitely be talking about that next week. But for now, we are out of time. Join me again next week as we try to finish up the Song of Eärendil. And folks, thank you for joining me for this week's Third Age Thursday. Stick around for more poetry over the rest of the series with First Age Fridays and our read through the Lay of Lathian. Check out patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus weekly episode, and more. And join me again tomorrow on Today's Tolkien Times for more quality cantos from the Lay of Leithian. If you're watching us on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow at Tolkien Times on all your social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.